welcome to Flights of Foundry panel. Short stories are not baby novels because they are definitely not. I'm Jamie Go. I'm an editor at Tactical Publications. Folks might know me from doing a bunch of steampunk and short stories here and there, and just my face showing up in places. And I have with me some amazing short story writers and an editor who will now introduce themselves according to clockwise on my screen. Why don't we start with you, Divya?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hope you're having a good virtual con, even if you're stuck at home doing laundry like me in between your panels. I'm SB Divya. I'm an author of science fiction and fantasy. My first novel, Machine Hood, just came out last month, and it was a hard lesson in how short stories are not baby novels, because prior to that, I was primarily a short story writer. I'm also the co-editor of Escape Pod, a weekly science fiction podcast that's been going since 2005. And by profession, I am an engineer working in signal processing and machine learning systems. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you, Divya. And Todd, why don't you go next?
Hi, my name is Todd Sanders. I am the director of the Air and Nothingness Press, and I publish limited editions of science fiction and fantasy, mostly anthologies and short story collections. And my day job is a graphic designer, which holds me very much in my nighttime job of being a publisher.
Nice, thank you. Erin?
Hello, everyone. I'm Erin Roberts, use she, her pronouns, and I am mostly a short story writer, but still believe that they are not baby novels. They are their own lovely things, and I'm excited to write them and read them and celebrate them, and am thrilled to be on the panel with such awesome people.
Great, thank you. Joe?
Hi, I'm Jose Uriarte. I am best known for short stories. I've got short stories published in Strange Horizons magazine.
Whose shirt you're wearing?
Yes, thank you. Lightspeed magazine, Fireside Fiction, a bunch of other places, and I've got a story coming out in a couple of weeks in Uncanny that I'm very excited about. When it's not writing stories, I teach high school math.
That's so cool. Awesome. Well, thank you all for being on this panel. Thanks to the audience for tuning in. And I kind of want to start with like a more general discussion of like this concept of, short stories are not baby novels before we move into like more technical, differences between short stories and writing process, because I know a couple of you guys want to talk about that. And so I'm really super curious where you guys think this assumption that that short stories are baby novels come from. Because I'm in Malaysia, and when I was growing up in Malaysia, I remember it being a thing that like short stories are like are not as good as novels. The novel is the medium that you want to be able to like achieve and attain, right? So we all started writing short stories in this vain attempt to like learn how to write so that we can write longer. Because in school, you start with like this tier, you start writing like really short essays, and as you get higher in education, you write longer and longer essays, right? So I was kind of wondering where you guys, where you have heard this assumption from, and what are the theories surrounding that? Who wants to jump in first?
Well, I guess I'll start as being the only one who's not a writer, oddly enough. Short stories and novels are similar in the fact that they have beginnings, middles, and ends. They have pacing. They have character development. So that, I think, is one thing that people think it's easy to map from one thing over to the other, whereas they actually have very different skill sets. You can be a master of either. You can be a master of both, but I think it takes a lot of craft and time to be good at either or at both.
All right, I'll jump in. I think the misunderstanding or misapprehension, perhaps is the better word, comes from people who haven't written both, whether it's readers, right? A lot of people tend to just read novels, and very few people actually read short stories. And for writers, the same goes. Like I know novelists who think that, well, I've written a whole novel, so what's the big deal writing a short story? And I myself am guilty of the inverse of that, which is, well, I've written short stories. I wrote a 20,000 word novella, so, an 80,000 word novel should be like 4 novellas, right? Like, how hard can that be? And I was so wrong. But I didn't know that until I actually sat down to write that 80,000 word novel and realized how very wrong I was.
It's a different kind of pain, but it's still pain.
Yeah. I also think, like, I tend to think that, like, the writing long and writing short is a tendency that people have, sort of like the extrovert, introvert. Like, I think some people try to write short stories and it always becomes a novel. Like, I know people who say that. I'm like, that had never happened to me. I have never been like, oh, it became a novel. No, it did not happen. And so I think what happens is sometimes people who are natural novelists, naturally long writers, will start writing short stories because that's what they had to write in school, or it was a quicker way to get published. And so for them, short stories were a stepping stone towards getting the part of their career where they could do what their true love was. But because of that, they maybe discount that for some people, like, that actually is the thing that they want to do the whole time.
Yeah, Jamie, I think you kind of hit it at the beginning. I can remember a time, or maybe not slightly before my time, but when in North American science fiction and fantasy, where that was the progression, you sold short stories and only then could you possibly hope to get the interest of an agent and be able to sell something. So that it was a journey person step or something that everybody passed through. And now you can certainly, I got representation for my novels before I had ever sold a short story. And I think the other thing that happens is, I think Divya noted that not a lot of people still read short stories, and so they don't really have another narrative besides that. And outside of science fiction and fantasy, we don't see that same thriving market, except maybe in academic circles. So the sense that these are kind of an apprentice proving ground.
That's a really interesting point, because it is a thing that anthologies, short story anthologies, do not sell as well as novels, according to Bookscan. Todd, I don't know if you've heard of this as well. And I find that it was also an impression that I noticed that if you've got a lot of short story publications that you can talk about on social media, then you're more likely to get noticed by an agent. And back in the day, the old days of science fiction, there were all these novels, which were fix-up novels or mosaic novels, right? They are short stories that are put together into the vague shape of a novel. And there are still novels being written like that today. But Erin, I kind of want to, like, you started on this on my next question, which is like, what's the difference between writing a short story and writing a novel, where like you start writing a short story and say, oh, this thing became a novel, what happened? And I noticed this a couple of times in my Clarion workshop, and Divya and Todd, maybe you've seen submissions like this before. I know I've gotten a few submissions before for my anthologies, where I'll look at the short story, and I was like, this isn't a short story. This wants to be a novel. And how can you tell that this short story is not a short story anymore? It's not in short story land. Its mind wishes to go further off the map of short story land into some other medium. Have you ever had that problem before, Joe?
Well, the phrase this wants to be a novel, that traumatizes me, because boy, at the beginning it seemed like every time I would submit a short story to my critique group, that's what I would hear. So I'm like, oh no, not again. And so I have a different critique group that I have for my young adult novel writing that I don't generally share short stories with, that I ask them to read The Substance of My Lives. And their critique was, these are all novel writers, because they're young adults. So that's the market. And they're like, why isn't this a novel? And I heard that same message again, and I just felt like, oh no, I've done it again. But in my mind, what I think about the problem that the character has to resolve. And I think, first of all, I think most premises could support either. But when I come down to the actual, what is the problem that a character needs to resolve, how many pieces will need to get put into place in order for that resolution to happen? How many dominoes need to get knocked down? And if it's something that can be pulled off in a scene or so, then I think it can be a short story. And if it's something where we're going to need a whole lot of scenes to show everything moving into place, then it won't be able to be a short story.
That's a really good point. Thank you. Erin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's two things that come to mind for me. And one is pacing, like the way you pace the language in a story. So if you have really languid, like really slow pacing in a story, I think sometimes people think should be a novel because you've only made it like 1/10 of the way through the story and we're already at 6,000 words. So sometimes when you pace slower, it like you don't get to all the points that you had in your head. You're thinking, oh, this story's going to hit A, B, and C, but because you're pacing slowly, you only make it to A, and your readers are like, yeah, B and C haven't gotten there yet. Or you're saying to yourself, oh, B and C aren't there yet. I think the other thing is implication. So in one of the things I love in short story writing is implying a larger world. But I think that there are ways to imply it where it's just like a quick thought, and there are ways to imply it where you almost need the camera to pan over, so to speak, and show the thing that you're implying. And if it feels like you need to show that on screen on the page, then it needs to be longer. Whereas if it's more like a throwaway line, then it doesn't actually need to end up on the page. It's kind of hard, like sort of one of those, you got to see it to know it. But I think those are the two things that I see when people are like, this needs to be longer. I need to explore the implication, or I need to like fully see the pacing go all the way through.
Thank you. That's a really cool point. Todd.
For me, having over the last few years read hundreds and hundreds of short stories as part of open calls, the few people who I've said that back to are the stories that I want just more of the story as a reader. I feel like there's a lot of detail there. I feel like the writing is up to the ability to be extended. I feel like the author knows that they are packing this in 3,000 words because they need to for my open call, but they could go much, much, much further with it. So it's the hint and the suggestion and the excitement of, I'm reading this thing and boy, I really want to read more of this. I want the whole world. I want 200, 300 pages of this to spend time in.
Is that true for you as well, Divya?
That's part of it. I guess the things that usually, so speaking with my escape pod editor hat on, I would say that the stories that come across my metaphorical desk are the ones that don't completely resolve the central problem for the character. So when I feel like the arc, I guess I really look at the arc of either the plot or the character, and it's like if that hasn't come to a resolution by the end, if there are still a lot of loose threads, then I feel like it's the beginnings of a longer story because it doesn't feel like things have wrapped up in a satisfying way. Obviously, as Erin said, there's always an implied world that's much larger. Like in any character's life, there's going to be more story to tell. But kind of to Joe's original point of like, what is the central problem, and does that particular central problem get completed or resolved by the end of this story, at which point it's done. And to me, that's complete. With my writer hat on, I will say what happened with Machinehood is exactly what you're all saying. I wrote a short story for a Codex contest. It didn't work. I fixed it and put it into a workshop. It still didn't work. And I realized as I was trying to, figure out why is this thing not working? Like, what is the problem here? And that was that the story I was trying to tell, the development of this particular character, and even the plot were packed into 5,000 words in a way that didn't give it anything enough time to breathe and make sense. And so the whole thing needed to be expanded so that on this side I could build the foundations, to the climax, and then on this side I could actually like let the climax have enough time to have the emotional impact I wanted it to have. And in the end, a lot of the short story ended up getting tossed out the window and rewritten anyway, because again, I had no idea what I was doing coming in to write this novel. But sort of the core ideas of, you know, the character development of what happens, and that transformation, that lingered, and that's when I really realized, okay, like there are some stories that just can't be put well into 5,000 words. Like it had a beginning, middle, and end, but none of it was satisfying because I rushed the reader through it to the point where they didn't really know this person well enough for the ending to have the impact I wanted it to have.
Mm.
You know, Divya, that reminds me, sorry, of something, which is that I feel like, because I was raised on, like, the first things I read were short story collections when I was a kid, and so I tend to think like this should just have more short stories in it. But that's often when I'm really drawn to the world. So when I'm drawn to the world, I tend to think, oh, this moment in the world was really interesting, and I would love to see another totally unrelated moment that shows me more of the world. But when things are character driven and there's a character arc more that's driving the story, I think that's when I'm more likely to say, I need more time with this character, which would make sense to happen in one story as opposed to like more scattershot series of event here, event there.
Okay, that brings up a really interesting point to segue into a more technical question. Erin, you brought up this amazing metaphor, like what size cage should you use for this slippery thing, this jellyfish of a story? Like how do you determine the length of a story, whether it's like a flash or a more quote unquote traditional short story, or like it wants to become a novella. There will be a panel later on a much bigger conversation about this. I think it's going to be at midnight UTC. And so, but I think we kind of do need to address that in this panel. Like how do we know that this is supposed to be a short story and this is no longer a short story? So what's the exact point, I guess? Like how do we determine like where we can end this short story? Todd, I think you want to talk a little bit about endings of short stories. So who wants to jump on that first?
All right, I'll go since I already put myself out there on this one. One thing that I found when writing short stories, especially in the early stages of my developing my short story craft, was that I often didn't know how long the story wanted to be, but I knew the story I wanted to tell. And so I didn't put a word count constraint on myself. I just told the story until it was done, and whatever length it was, that was the length, right? So if it ended up being 1,500 words, okay, it's maybe borderline flash. If it's 7,000 words, it's borderline novelette, right? So I just kind of let it breathe into its natural length. And some of that was just, I didn't have an intuition for how long a story would be, you know, once I had the idea in my head. And I think with time and experience and having written different lengths, I'm starting to develop a little bit more of that intuition for, you know, if there's this much complexity in the plot, if there's this much development in the character, this is probably how long the story is going to end up needing to be. And so I can a little bit better tailor, like if I'm doing writing something for an anthology call where they say we need a 3,000 word story, I might come up with an idea and realize, you know what, this has way too many twists and turns to fit into 3,000 words, or, you know, this person's character development is going to take only 500 words because they're very flat. So, you know, it can go either way, right? But I think in starting out, especially when you're a new writer, you don't necessarily have that intuitive feel for complexity. So sometimes it's better just to go with your flow. And if it's not the right length, write a different story. Well, that's easier said with short stories. If it ends up being a novel, you know, maybe you get to 30,000 words and then take a break.
I would like to get better at that skill that you describe. I think I have a pretty good feel for how I approach writing flash versus how I approach writing short versus how I approach writing novels. But within that short story, there's a lot of variation. I did, just as a vaguely relevant anecdote, I did have somebody reach out to me recently, encouraging me to write a short story for a themed anthology, and I was brainstorming and trying to come up with something, and I came up with an idea that pleased me, but because it was a little bit more out there than a lot of my usual fare is, and I felt more creative. But then I realized that this idea was going to need a lot of background exposition, a lot of history, a lot of you were gonna need time to understand what things meant, or I could just tell you, but then you weren't going to feel it. And so that was kind of, I was like, wow, I really love what I've come up with, but there's just no way that this is ever going to be a short story. So this might be something I pursue as a novel somewhere, back burner. But yeah, as far as flash fiction, since you mentioned that, the flash stories that stick with me the most tend to feel like prose poetry, and so I tend to think in terms of a metaphor that a conceit really that runs through the whole story that allows the story to be working on multiple levels with just one set of words.
Yeah, I often think of flash as like those moments in life that are so short but so meaningful, like a kiss or a punch, or like something that only takes an instant, but like there's so much in that instant. And whenever like the flash that sticks with me is like that, it's always like a mood or a gasp, like that kind of feel to it, which I love. I would say, to answer the actual question, I think you learn yourself as a writer as you go, and I know that I edit up. So like when I originally write stories, I am implying so much that I know that when I give it to other people, they're like, "What's happening?" And I'm like, "Oh no, you didn't know from that M dash like the whole history of this character? No, okay, I probably need to at least put a few words on that." So if I start writing and I get like, I'm like, okay, I've gotten through the first, scene or so, and it's already 2,000 or 3,000 words, and I'm like, okay, this may end up being novella length, because that means that my first draft will be 7,000 words. And then once I go through and make it something that anybody not in my brain will understand, like that's going to like double the length. So I've learned that about myself. Usually if things that end up a short story for me, the first draft was 2,000 words, 1,500 words, and I just add and add and add. So I think a lot of it's just like, yourself and you're like, did that again. And then, you get better as you go.
That is a really good point. I tend to be the opposite direction. I'm kind of self-indulgent as I write, so then when I edit, I'm working hard to trim.
Todd, did you want to add to that?
With the anthologies that I do, the open calls, I'm asking for usually between 1,000 and 3,000 words. And I do get a number of stories where it feels like the author spent 90% of their time writing the story, and then they suddenly figure out, oh, I've only got 10% left in the story, which can be a problem. But I tell a lot of authors who write to me, I say, it's, yes, 1,000, 3,000 words, but the story is what's important. So if you need to take X amount extra or whatever, we'll work this out. I realize that my story counts are those word counts are small, but I agree also with what Aaron was saying, is that it was reminded me actually of James Joyce, who is quite a master at short stories, and he always wrote about this idea of the epiphany, that there's this one moment in the story that the whole thing hinges upon, or the character has that golden, glowing aura of a moment. And flash fiction can really, yes, indeed, I agree, bring that out in stories.
Thank you. I noticed that we're talking a lot about like, there is too much to fit into this short story, and therefore the short story wants to be a novel. And I'm like, well, why are we saying that? Why are we doing a novel for further world building? Couldn't we just write another short story in the same world? Like, have you guys, like those of you who've written short stories, like, do you guys do that? Do you write several short stories in the same universe just to, get a feel for like the universe as it wants to be, instead of writing an entire novel or an entire trilogy as it is?
I do that. I'm all about that.
Joe, have you done that?
So I've done that. I've written in a couple different things, but Joe, go ahead.
No, I was just I figured my answer would definitely be the most boring, so let me get it out of the way fast. I have never done that because my stories tend to be contemporary fantasy, and so I don't have that really amazing, cool world building. So um, they're all one-offs.
I have never done that, and I don't write contemporary. I write all kinds of stuff, mostly near and far future. But I tend to like ideas, idea-driven stories, and so it's hard to explore, a shiny new idea set in the same old world, right? I can take a piece of that world and expand it, but often I'm like, but I have this other really cool idea, and I'm going to build a whole new world around that. And so, yeah, so I haven't, and it's funny because people always ask me, they're like, there's so much packed into your one thing. Like, are you going to write more? Especially for the novella or even my novel. Even though it's a 400-page novel, they're like, there's like 50 great things you could pull apart in here. And I'm like, yes. Or I could write you 400 pages of like 50 new ideas you haven't thought. So what's it gonna be? And as a writer, I always am like, I suppose it'd be cool if I was like famous enough that a publisher begged me to write sequels, but for the time being, for my own purposes, I'm always chasing the next shiny new thing.
Right.
Yeah, and I love doing that. I'm all about writing the same world and the same idea. Like I have one of my games, actually I have an interactive fiction piece that takes place in the same universe as a short story.
Oh, cool.
And I'm working on another short story in that same universe. And actually,
well, now you have to tell us what the name of that interaction fiction is,
I will.
so we can find it.
Yes, I will do that. It's my story that I wrote, Sour Milk Girls, takes place in a memory as a commodity universe, and I wrote a piece called Thanks for the Memories, which is another piece there. And now I'm working, like I said, on another one that's also in that same world because I just love it so much, and also because I actually originally wanted to write a novel in that world, but was like, I don't understand these characters enough, honestly. What if I wrote like some critical moments in their past just as a writing exercise? And then I was like, oh, this writing exercise is kind of fun. Actually, maybe this is a whole story. Maybe I could publish this story. So I'm like the reverse. And I've done that several times where I actually have novel ideas and I'm like, I don't have the energy for this whole novel, but I would love to explore this one aspect of a character or a thing in the world. And then I figure if I build up enough short stories in the world, maybe one day they will generate like Captain Planet, their powers combined, and then I'll want to write the novel. Hasn't worked yet.
Yeah, Divya, go ahead.
I wanted to, what Erin said, I wanted to give a shout out to Lavanya Lakshminarayan's awesome book called Analog Virtual, which is a novel-length work of linked short stories, all set in the same world. And you get things that follow some of the characters, a second time, but usually through a different point of view. And it's really brilliant in the way it's architected. So Erin, rather than all those short stories turning into a novel, you could actually bundle them potentially.
Yeah.
Like, especially if there's a through line that kind of goes through them in time, and just stack up your short stories, and a book will all be ready for you.
Yeah, that's a thing in Central Station by Lavi Tidar as well. You can either read it as a straight novel, but like every chapter is focuses on a different character on this one station. There's also The Stars Change by Marianne Mohanraj, which starts off as like a bunch of short stories and then becomes this more singular narrative, and all the characters kind of like converge after all these shorts. And I love the works of Court Wayner Smith, who writes all these short stories set in this one universe. Right? And over the span of however many years he wrote these short stories, you see some characters kind of like show up, or some concepts show up in a different way. And then he wrote a novel which is completely different from anything. Like, it's not an expansion or anything in his short story universe. So yeah, that is an option. And therefore, I am a big fan of this whole writing multiple short stories in a universe to figure out whether or not you want to write a novel in it, to figure out the background for the novel, which is also a thing that I'm trying to do with a fever dream I had. So
I just published one of those books last month.
Oh,
Marianne, who wrote a series of interlocked short stories about a group of Roman centurions who fight supernatural terrors during the Gallic Wars. And I love those kind of books too. Yeah.
Right. And like when now you're making me curious. Like you've edited those, right? When you were editing it, how different was that experience from editing a short story anthology, Todd?
Well, it's different in that it was only one. It's one author's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of my anthologies are themed, and I love the variety. I love the fact that there's all these different voices, people, different genders, different countries, and what they bring to these anthologies. And yes, doing Brandon's singular anthology with one voice was different because I could see him working on some of the stories are told in slightly different manners than other stories, and he had the imagination and the drive to do that exploration. So that was nice to see. But having it all be the same set of characters in the same universe in the same time period, the editing also, then there was a lot of consistency that needed to be addressed across them all, that make sure that all the character names are spelled correctly, that the details are the same from story to story, that the time periods, that the stories feel like they're going in some sort of order, much like Cordwainer Smith, that there's this sort of history that's all. And so that's one thing I don't have to worry about these other anthologies, is this sort of overall narrative consistency that there needs to be.
Oh, that's interesting. I had a very similar experience when editing Marie Brennan's Driftwood, which is a collection of many of her already published short stories and a new one, but there was a frame narrative to kind of hang all these short stories together. But now I'm kind of curious what you guys think about what it is that short stories can do that novels can't do. Like, what draws you to the short story form? Like, when you look at this story and it's like, this has to be a short story, I don't want this to be a novel, or something like that. Or this kind of story can't be a novel. Or what can you do in short stories that you can't do in novels?
I think that the strength of the short story medium for me is that short stories can provide a really acute emotional experience as opposed to something that you build up to. I feel that in a long work, you can eventually have me reach a point where I've been through so much with the character that I look back on that, and that in and of itself becomes an emotional experience. But I don't necessarily perceive quite the intensity of the emotional punch. I don't think you can sustain that for 80,000, 100,000 words. Whereas a short story that is really pared down and doesn't, that just kind of comes in, hits you, and leaves, can really be a very profound emotional experience. And that's a lot of people that I talk to who see short fiction as a stepping stone onto something else have never really loved short stories as readers, but I do. And I read a ton of short fiction, and that's the thing that really sticks with me is the short story that just, this is 800 words and I'm still thinking about it 7 years later.
I have to say, more and more I'm pushing authors who are talking to me about what am I looking for in these anthologies. I'm telling them to really push it further, be more exploratory, since there's less of a commitment than a novel, which can take years and years and years to write. Go ahead and take those chances. Go ahead and do something way different. I'm remembering now that he's one of the older people out there, Robert Heinlein, but All You Zombies, that was a short story that could never, I think, be a novel, that it would lose its punch. I'm not going to, even though that story was written a long time ago, I'm not going to do any spoilers about it, but that short story is, I think, the perfect size and the perfect means within a short story with how he manipulated the various characters in that story. So I would say that take a chance. There's much less commitment, so you can work out, some of your wilder ideas in short stories that you may not feel you can do in novels because of the extended narrative format.
Yeah, that also reminds me of, I think one of the things you can do in short stories is have a really strong voice for the character, and it's easier to sustain that over a short format than over hundreds and hundreds of pages, both for the writer and for the reader. And also non-traditional narrative formats, right? Like the list story or something that's told completely out of order. Or like I wrote a flash fiction piece where it went through years and powers of 2, starting from year 1 to year 1024 in like 950 words. And each year got proportionately longer in terms of the amount of text associated with it. And this is not a thing I'm going to sustain, obviously, to 2 to the power of like 100 or something. But also just in terms of, again, the attention span of the reader, and also the effort and energy it takes, I guess, or the energy you invest in the story can be different. And so you can sustain these sort of high levels of attention and energy over a short format, and that allows the author to then really play with how they deliver that story to you.
Yeah, I would
There's
say
also something that for sharpness and brevity, that short story formats teach you to be economical with your words, and that if you do then move on to novels, you can retain some of that aspect.
Yeah, I also think, like, to me, there's 2 answers to this, and like one's more cynical. So the less cynical answer is there are, I think, some really fun things you can do with voice. I like to play with like the reliability of narrators, with unlikable characters, and some of those things. Like, it's hard to sustain somebody who's like not the best. Like, I don't know that readers want to be like, I'm in the head of this jerk forever. Like, but for like a sitting, like, okay, that's a really, you're willing to like maybe absorb that in a different way, and you don't feel like you're tormenting poor readers. I also, on a cynical side, would say that I think you don't have to sell the short story in the same way. Like, you have to sell it to a publisher, but you don't have to convince somebody that like sales will come as a result of your story. And therefore, if you are somebody working outside of traditional 3-act like narrative forms, if you're a person of color, if you're doing things that not people are not used to and is scary, it may be easier for you to put something in a short story and have folks say, okay, I'm going to buy that short story, than it would be to make it work on a novel level. Like, not that you can't make it work as a writer, but you may not be able to get a publisher to agree that it will work. And I think sometimes short stories push those boundaries so that then novels can catch up to them. So you're like, hey, this worked and it was great and it won all these awards and it wasn't a traditional structure. Maybe then a novel in that structure would work. People are thinking on the business end of things.
I think that's an awesome point, Erin, because I think about how I read a lot of professionals in the novel business talk about things that they would like to see, but then I don't actually see those things actually appear so much. But I see them appear much more frequently in the short fiction world. And I do like that full touch at the end of, if people see enough of it in the short fiction world, then, then that can push the novel world to say, this is possible.
I'll also add specifically for the subgenre of near future science fiction, I think short stories are a somewhat easier space to work in part because you can keep on top of current events faster, right? Like when you're writing a novel, it takes a year or maybe 2 or 3 to write the novel, and then it has to sell and then get to the publisher. And so sometimes it can be several years between the writing of it and when it gets into the hands of the readers. And although it might be set 20 years from now, enough things can happen in 4 years these days, right? That it'll throw off some of the veracity of what you've built in your novel. And so a 4,000 word short story is something you can cycle much faster, right? And to Todd's point, you can play with very relevant present day ideas and get them into the hands of readers with a much shorter life cycle.
Thank you. All right, we have about slightly more than 5 minutes left. So I guess this is the good time for audience questions. I'm now looking at a different screen and wondering, let's see if anyone's got specific question. If anyone's got a question in the Discord, if you could just put out like put question at the beginning of your post, and that'll help you identify which one's a question and which is not. What is a whole conversation about fan fiction happening here? And someone has done a shout out to Song for a New Day by Sarah Pinska, which went from novelette to novel. Question: what is the biggest mistake writers make with short stories?
Waiting too long to end them.
Or I'll add to that and say, or not having a proper ending at all. In which case it wants to be a novel.
Right.
Trying to write them without reading them?
Oh, that's a call out. Erin?
I don't know if those are all bad. I do not have anything to add.
All right. Another question. When writing multiple short stories in the same universe, do you still sell them individually? Does it get weird selling to different markets? I don't know who among you guys have done that. I sell to different markets, and it is not weird. I've sold in my Piranha Steampunk universe. I sold to like 3 different markets already, and it's just you just treat them as individual short stories and all the attendant world building has to be present within that one short story. Otherwise, you haven't done it right. If you're missing pieces, like all the different short stories need to all the different pieces need to come together and make sense and enhance the reading. But on its own, it should work. Erin, did you notice the same when you were doing that?
Yeah, I would say, you treat them individually. The one thing I will say, like in your own heart that you may have to do is like, let's say Market One published your first one, and then you try to get them to publish your next one, and they're like, not feeling it. Like you have to be ready for that to possibly happen and just continue to treat it as its own thing, because I think you can get attached to it. It's like, you liked my first child, but you hate my other child. You have to like just think of it on its own and be like, move your way through the way you would with any other short story that you've written.
I think historically too, that's never been the case. If we look at Astounding and Analog and Fantasy Science Fiction, and let's say that the 30s through the 90s, authors were having the same worlds with different stories through different markets, and there wasn't really ever a problem with that.
Mm-hmm. All right. Oh, this is a process question. How does your process change when writing a short story versus writing a novel? And I think that will be the last one that we can address.
I'll give a very short answer, I guess. For short,
that feels like it wants to be a bigger answer. Huh?
Yeah, this is an answer that feels like it wants to be part of an entire panel topic. But the short version is for short stories, I tend to compose them mostly in my head, in the shower or in the car or wherever. And for novels, I actually do a certain amount of planning up front, and that amount of planning has grown with each successive novel I have written. So that is my very short answer to that question for process.
My process is pretty similar for both, except that I write novels in Scrivener and I write short stories in Microsoft Word. I'm trying to think. I know there's more to it than that.
But now you have to tell us why.
I don't even know. I think because for a novel, I feel like I want. Well, actually, and this may kind of factor into it. With novels, I have all kinds of ancillary materials. I have timelines of when these things happen. I have photographs for references, and I have all those materials that the Scrivener allows you to have not appear, like all those resource files. And with a short story, I don't have that, and I'm not going to move scenes around probably, so I don't need those organizational tools. So I guess it really comes down to organization.
I once tried to write a short story. People are like, Scrivener's so cool. And I was like, I'll write my short stories in Scrivener. But it felt very choppy. Like, I feel like I don't know. There's something about a short story to me that's like a dive in a pool. You dive in, you swim, and then you're done.
Yeah.
And like Scrivener was like, oh, this little piece is here. No, this little piece is there. And it was, for me as a writer, very choppy. So I'm sure there are people who do it, but it seemed very odd for
I
me
know
as
there
a
are.
person.
Yeah. I will talk more about my feelings about Scrivener in the Discord, but we have to wrap up. So closing remarks, where can we find, are you doing any other Flight of Foundry panels? And where else on the internet can we find you? And what's your social medias or your website? Let's go backwards. So, Joe, why don't you start that off?
So on Twitter, I'm Labyrinth Rat, and my website is labyrinthrat.com. If you go to joseariarte.com, you should also still end up there, though. And what I've got coming out soon, I mentioned already, I plugged the story I've got coming out in Uncanny. That's the only thing that I have any kind of a firm date on right now. At Flights of Foundry tomorrow, I am doing the panel on querying etiquette, and I think that is at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So does that make that be at 8 p.m. UTC? Maybe, I don't know.
What is time, Erin?
You can find me on Twitter at Narelle, Nirele. It is actually L Erin backwards because I'm not good at Spanish. And my writing website is writingwonder.com. I think I'm on a panel, if you want to talk more about different types of process tomorrow, about prose and game writing in conversation.
Todd?
The best place to find me is also on Twitter, AAN Press, as well as aanpress.com, which is the website for the Air Nothingness Press. And I don't have any other Flights of Foundry events, but I am in the dealer room and on the dealer page.
Thanks. Divya.
All right. You can find all about me on my website, spdivya.com. You can find me on Twitter as @Divya'sTweets. My novel Machine Head is out in print and audio, like pretty much everywhere you can normally find books, but I always encourage you to buy from your local independent bookshop to support them. Escape Pod is at escapepod.org, and I'm doing several more things. In about an hour from now, I'm running a co-working session. And then an hour after that, I'm doing my reading. And tomorrow I have a panel called Behind the Microphone, talking about podcasting and audio production.
Because you do work for Escape Pod. Gotta remind people of that. Thank you so much for being part of this panel. Thank you so much, audience, for participating and watching. And we will see, we're just gonna end here, I guess. And you guys have a really good evening.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah. Ciao, guys.